Hey everybody, and welcome back to Frontend Expert. In this video, we will be discussing variables within JavaScript and the different ways that we can define them. So traditionally, we just used the var keyword. So I could say something like var_num equals 0. And then I could say maybe console.log var_num, and we could console log the var_num. And then we will see when we log this out, we get var_num and then we get 0. However, now there is actually another way in JavaScript to declare a variable, and that will be the let keyword. So we can say something like let_num equals 0 as well. And then we can copy this console log code, and you'll see it will do the exact same thing. We'll change this to let_num and change the string as well to let_num, just so we know what we are looking at. Run this code and you see we get var_num is 0 and let_num is 0. Okay, so what's the difference here? Why does this matter? Why do we have two keywords to do seemingly the same thing? And most of the time, there's not much of a difference. Most of the time, it won't actually matter. But there are two key differences between var and let that will change the way that they work in certain circumstances and should guide our decision as to which one we should be using. So the first one here is regarding hoisting. And what hoisting simply means is that when a variable is declared, it gets hoisted to the top of its scope, meaning that the declaration happens first, regardless of where in the code that declaration actually was. So let me give you an example. Let's move these console.log statements. So I will copy these and I'm going to put them above the declaration lines. And you would assume that this would mean that we're just going to throw an error because var_num's not defined and let_num is not defined. But var is going to be hoisted and initialized to a value of undefined, meaning that var_num is initialized above these console logs at the top of its scope. However, when let variables are hoisted, they aren't initialized and thus cannot be referenced until the line they got declared in JavaScript. Oftentimes, you'll hear let be referred to as not being hoisted at all because from a practical perspective, we can mostly just ignore this hoisting. It's really just happening for the engine to allocate memory it will need ahead of time, but it is still being hoisted. All that said, the assignment of var_num to 0 only happens on line 4. So this is roughly equivalent to if we declared var_num at the top of this file, just letting it be undefined, then below the logs, reassigned it to 0. Let, on the other hand, for practical purposes, does not exist until its declaration at the end of the program. But if I remove this code, you'll see that when I run it, we do get a reference error because we cannot access let_num before its initialization. However, before that happened, we did log out var_num, and it had a value of undefined because this is the value it was initialized to when it was hoisted. Then, when we got to the console log of let_num, it threw an error because we are trying to access a variable before it has been initialized. Okay, so now let's go back to the code for a moment and let's add a function. So I'm just going to add a function. We can call this test, and then I'm going to move this code inside of the function. And then we will also move the console logs back to the end so that we don't get this error message anymore. And then after this, let's just call the test function. And as you might expect, this is going to do the same thing we initially had. We print out var_num as 0, and we print out let_num as 0 as well. But the difference here is now going to be within scoping. So currently, both var_num and let_num are scoped to this entire function. But that won't always be the case because var is scoped to the whole function. So no matter what we do, var_num is scoped to this whole test function. However, let_num is only scoped to the block it is defined in, and we call a block essentially just any time we have curly braces. So let me give you an example. Let's create a new if statement, and I'll just say if true. So we're always going to get into this if statement, but it's just for demonstration purposes. And let's move var_num and let_num inside of the if statement. Now, in most programming languages, var_num and let_num would only be defined within this if statement. So these console log messages should throw errors. But var_num is accessible in all of the test function. So var_num will print just as you would expect. However, letNum will throw an error because letNum is only accessible in the block. And we can see this when we run the code. We get essentially the same thing we had before where we still print out varnum, but letNum, it throws us an error that says letNum is not defined because down here there is no variable called letNum. It is only defined within this if true block. Okay, so now the question is, which one of these should we be using? And it's a bit of an ambiguous, it depends type of answer, but most of the time we will want to use let. And the reason for this is just that the rules that define let are more natural. The variable shouldn't be declared before you have the let keyword. It shouldn't be hoisted to the top of the function. That feels unnatural most of the time. Moreover, we usually only want a variable within the block it was defined. We don't want variables accessible all throughout our function if they were just supposed to be part of an if statement or a for loop. So in general, let works just like variables in most other programming languages, and var tends to be a little bit different and it doesn't follow the rules that we expect from general programming principles. So let just makes it a lot easier for people to come into JavaScript, as well as it's much easier to avoid writing buggy code. And now there is one more keyword we can use to give names to values, and that's going to be const. So for example, I could say const_num and set this equal to 0. And what const does is the exact same thing as let, except for the fact that this is a constant, which means that the value can never be reassigned. So for example, let's move letNum out of the if statement for a moment, and we can actually just get rid of this varnum because most of the time we won't be using this. And let's see the difference between constNum and letNum. So first we can console.log out constNum as well, and then we will say constNum. And when I run this, we get 0 and 0. However, if I were to say letNum now equals 2 and constNum now equals 2, you'll see what we get is an error on the constNum equals 2 because we are trying to assign to a constant variable. So the easiest way to think about this is that a constant variable can never have an equal sign after it again, a single equal assignment operator. So constNum equals 2 throws an error because of the fact that constNum had already been assigned up here on line 2. So we can only assign a value with const one time. However, with constant values, we can still mutate them. We just can't reassign them. So for example, if I were to make constant array and set this equal to maybe an array that has 1, 2, and 3 in it, then I could still add to this array, I just can't reassign it. So for example, if I were to now say array equals, and then we had this array of 1, 2, 3, 4, this is going to throw an error. So I will comment out this code for a moment. So this now throws an error that we were trying to assign to a constant variable, and this is what we expect. However, one thing I could do is get rid of this code and instead say array.push, so this is the function to add a value to the end of the array, say push 4, and now we no longer get an error, and I could even console.log out the array, and you'll see it has changed to include the value 4. And the reason this works is because array.push did not reassign the array variable. This is still the same array, it just has one more value in it. And this is a very key point in JavaScript. JavaScript is a very functional language. So most of the time we want to just call functions on our values rather than ever reassigning the values to something new. That's not to say that we never need reassignment. Sometimes we do, but most of the time we actually don't. So what this means is that most of our variables we will actually define with the constant keyword, and we will only use the let keyword when we need to reassign that variable again. So when we need to set it equal to something else, we will use let, but the rest of the time we should usually be using const. And then finally, var should most of the time just be avoided. There's not a ton of use cases for var anymore, but if you're working in a code base that is already using var, or you have a specific reason to need it, there's nothing wrong with using var. It is not a deprecated keyword or anything like that. It's not going anywhere, but it is advised to usually use let and const. And with that, that's going to be the end of this video on variables in JavaScript. I hope you found it helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.